Hello, friends. My name is Iris Josephina. I'm your host, and you are listening to the Planting Seeds podcast. On the Planting Seeds podcast, we explore how we can cultivate a more gentle relationship with our cyclical bodies, the earth, each other, and the world around us through using our senses, science, the subtle, and the secret. On Planting Seeds, we talk about all those topics you've always wanted to talk about. We are shamelessly opening up the conversations that we all so desperately need to settle in our precious bodies and relate to each other in a more open, truthful, and empowered way. I'm so glad you're here today.
Welcome everyone to a new episode of the Planting Seeds podcast. Today we are talking about endometriosis with Jessica Duffin, who is a certified women's health coach specialized in endometriosis and small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Through her articles, podcasts, and coaching, she empowers people all over the world to live and thrive with endometriosis and its associated conditions using nutrition and holistic lifestyle changes. And Jessica's own experience with endometriosis and the relief she felt from taking a natural approach left her determined to share these alternative options with others so they wouldn't suffer as she had. She started this endo life in 2014, and since then she dedicated her life to studying and working with endometriosis, training with some of the world leading specialists, working with renowned endo charities and endometriosis news outlets, as well as interviewing experts for her own podcast. Welcome to the show, Jessica. I'm so happy that you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, Iris. It's so lovely to work with you and connect with you like this after training together.
Yeah, we were in a training together with Nicole Jardim, which was a beautiful, beautiful training.
It was so good. It was my favorite.
Mine too.
So lovely. Such a lovely group.
So today we are talking about endometriosis, which is a sensitive topic, which is a big topic. And before we fully dive in, I am curious whether you could just in a few words explain what endometriosis is and why people should know about it.
Yeah, so endometriosis is a chronic inflammatory condition where cells that are similar but not the same. So that's really important. Similar but not the same to the cells that grow in the uterine lining grow outside of the uterus on places like the fallopian tubes, the ovaries, the pelvic cavity, something called the pouch of Douglas. So this is an area behind the uterus. They can grow on the bladder, and they can grow anywhere in the body, actually. They've been found all over the body. And what happens is, because they are similar to the endometrial cells that grow inside the uterus, they follow the menstrual cycle. So they build up and they break down along with the menstrual cycle. And as a result, we get this internal bleeding and kind of cramping and pain, and it leads to inflammation and swelling and a buildup of scar tissue called adhesions. And it causes extreme pain, but pain isn't really, isn't where it ends. And the pain can be around your period. For some people, it's around ovulation. And for some people, it's chronic and it's daily, or it occurs, at random points. Now, like I said, this pain isn't the only symptom. The pain can radiate down. For some people, it can go down their legs, it can go down their back, there can be pain in the rectum, but also people end up with fatigue, brain fog, they can end up having full body pain if they've lived with a chronic pain for a long time, pain with bowel movements and urination, bladder pain, a lot of abdominal issues, so a lot of bloating, which is called the endobelly, IBS issues, so constipation or diarrhea, pain during sex. So there's really, a wide-reaching range of symptoms, and it can affect fertility as well for some people.
Wow, every time I hear about endometriosis, I'm trying to imagine what it feels like in my own body, but I just can't. It sounds such an intense journey to be on when this is a condition to live with. And of course, you had your own experience with it, and I'm curious about your own journey with endometriosis.
Yeah. So, for context, I guess I should say I'm 34. I did actually spend all of last year thinking I was 32. And then my boyfriend reminded me on my birthday that I was not. So I'm 34 and my symptoms actually started quite late. So a lot of people will start experiencing symptoms as early as their first period. That didn't happen for me. I didn't start getting symptoms until I was about 17, 18. And it took 5 years to get a diagnosis, which is an appalling amount of time, but is actually shorter than the average. So the average is about 8 years. It used to be 11. And I believe in America it's longer. So I had continuously gone to the doctors. I had gone from having no period pain whatsoever to literally in the space of a cycle having excruciating period pain. And in addition to that, I was having painful sex. Now, I hadn't had sex before, so this was my first experience. Maybe that was always going to have happened. But I, was getting excruciating pain during sex. I was getting awful period pain, which was 10 out of 10 on the pain scale. I could barely stand up. And I repeatedly went to the doctors and it was dismissed. And then finally, my boyfriend at the time came with me to the doctors and then they referred me to a gynecologist when he told them what he saw. So surprise, surprise. And I had my first surgery. So it's called a laparoscopy. And it's just in very small incisions, keyhole surgery, where they look for the endometriosis and they should excise. So basically cut out the endometriosis that they find. Now, at the time, at this point, I hadn't worked with any of the charities. I had no information on endometriosis, really. I did have a best friend who had it, but she was under the same doctor. So neither of us were none the wiser. But I had this surgery and it was ablation surgery. So with ablation, that's essentially burning off the endometriosis. And that can leave cells behind. And it can also do damage. It can actually cause more pain. Now, the research that is coming out is showing that excision is kind of the gold standard in terms of surgery. But in some cases, a surgeon may not be able to do excision. Even though it is the best, there might be a few places where they have to use a little bit of ablation if it's going to cause a lot of damage. So, for example, if it's on a fallopian tube or ovary, they might be forced to use a little bit of ablation. Now, huge disclaimer here, I'm not a endo specialist or surgeon, so you'll need to talk to them in more detail about that. But I do have an interview with Dr. Andrew Cook on my podcast where he talks about this and you can discuss it with, a specialist. But I had ablation for the entire thing. So there was lots of endometriosis left over. So I had pain-free periods after that for a year. And at the time, I was not the person that you know now, Iris. I did not want to talk about periods. I didn't care about my body. I was not interested in talking about bras or I was not okay with any of that kind of stuff. So as far as I was concerned, that was it. I actually had, whilst I was drugged up coming out of surgery, I had a doctor or a nurse come around and just say, we found the endometriosis, we got rid of it. That's it. They didn't tell me it was going to come back or that it could come back. And then a year later, it did come back. So I started the process again. Now, I was no longer under a gynecologist at that point because they discharge you. And so I had to start the process again. And the GP that I went to said, I'm not referring you yet, come back when it's excruciating. So I listened and went back later on when I couldn't bear it anymore. But of course, by that point over here in the UK, you then have these crazy long waiting times. So I then had about 6 to 8 months to wait to see the gynecologist before they referred me to surgery, which can be like a year's wait. So it should have really happened earlier in the process. And so whilst I was waiting for my gynecologist appointment, I actually had a family member die overseas. And so I had arranged to go and spend some time with my family there. And I had my appointment with the gynecologist and I said, look, I'm going to go away. So it wasn't for the funeral that had been missed. So it was booked. It was in advance. And I said, I'm going to be going away at this time. And they were like, don't worry, we'll defer your surgery. We'll put a note down on your file. And I was like, okay. I was, a young girl. I thought that was fine. I didn't think to chase it up. And then whilst I was away in South Africa, I had a call from a really angry receptionist saying that I should have been in for my pre-op appointment. She wouldn't listen to me. I said I had been told it would be like deferred until my return. And she took me off the list entirely and said I had to go back to my GP and start the process again. So at this point, we were about 18 months, a year and a half or something into this. I was desperate by this point. I had been in pain for such a long time that I went down a rabbit hole of looking at ways that I could manage it myself until I could see the surgeon. Because at the time, as far as I was concerned, the only options provided to me, the only treatments available were surgery, hormonal birth control, which I couldn't take because I'd taken multiple and they had really, really bad reactions for me. And some of them I actually couldn't take medically, and pain relief, which wasn't working. The pain relief wasn't working. And I was taking, unhealthy levels of codeine, and I couldn't take any more. And so I had been waiting for this surgery, sort of pinning all of my hopes on that. But this forced me to go down a rabbit hole of looking into alternatives like nutrition and essential oils and all of these different things. And it was really hard to find that information because, this is 7 years ago now, if not a little bit longer. And I had gone down this rabbit hole and I pieced together basically my own protocol. And I sort of did a mock elimination diet for a month, which I'm not saying anyone listening needs to do. There is a way to do this that is tailored to you, and not everyone needs to do what I did. And I did it in an uneducated way because I was just, researching on my own. But I removed sugar, dairy, gluten, and caffeine for a month in order to calm down any inflammation in case those were inflammatories for my body. And my next period was pain-free. And I was just, me and my partner, who I'm still with now, it was just like, it was unbelievable. Even to this day, I was talking to my members last night and I said, I still don't believe it. Every time a period comes, I still worry about what's going to happen. It's not like an anxiety, but it's in the back of my head, like, this might be a bad one. And it was just nothing short of a miracle. And I was just so angry that firstly, this information wasn't readily available. I only looked it up because I got pushed into a situation where I had to kind of come out fighting and look for an alternative. And I just thought there could be other people out there who never think to look for this information or never get introduced to this information. And unfortunately, like my friend, by this point, she had had 7 or 8 surgeries. And so I was just thinking about all of these people who weren't getting all of the information that they needed to manage their endo from lots of different angles. So I did eventually have the second surgery about 6 months later, I think, and it didn't change anything. It didn't help at all. And I basically tested it. I went back to kind of my old diet and the pain was exactly the same. And when I went to see them in the follow-up, they were like, we used ablation, so there was some endo left behind. But I had specifically gone to these doctors for excision. So I was like, okay, well, that was a bit of a waste of time. But now what we know from the research is that for people with superficial endometriosis, which is what I have, surgery can actually make the pain worse because the nerve endings are sort of in that region. So it can damage the nerve. So I think that for me, surgery, I needed my initial diagnostic, but I don't think that second surgery really served me. If anything, it caused me more complications. So ever since, I've been managing my endometriosis naturally and holistically, and then obviously went on to do all of the training that you described earlier in the introduction.
Wow, Jessica, thank you so much for sharing all of this. Like, my jaw was on the floor throughout your entire story, starting with how you have been taken seriously only when you brought your boyfriend to your doctor's office. Like, how insane is that?
I know.
Like you coming there with your story, with your lived experience, and then you are dismissed and sent back home and not referred to a doctor in a hospital. And then when you bring somebody to affirm what you're feeling, then all of a sudden you're taken seriously. Like, my goodness.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I've had many years to sit on it now, but I haven't made peace with it, but I'm used to it. But I have consultation calls with new clients all the time, and I see new clients all the time. And when they tell me their story, it's always some version of what I've been through, and a lot worse in most cases, and actually quite appalling treatment. Some really awful things have been said to my clients, which, I can't repeat because of confidentiality, but it just still astounds me that this condition is really widely recognized now, talked about a lot in the press and media, and yet we're still getting such mistreatment and huge amounts of disrespect. And often we're just treated as if we're like hysterical women still, right? That's still a thing.
And that happens with so many conditions that are out there. Yeah, it keeps blowing my mind. And I think we're both seeing clients who share their stories with us. And I'm like 100% sure that we hear similar things. And I feel that that is also why it's so important that you and I are here, and that we have studied, and that we have find our own way with our own issues and conditions. And with that, I am curious what you would say to people, how to start to look at this condition from a more holistic point of view, like you did. You had the curiosity to go look beyond what the medical system was offering you. But I also know that if people have no idea where to start, it can be very overwhelming. And I'm curious whether you could share more on how to manage this from a holistic point of view.
Yeah, of course. Before we go into that, I do just want to mention, because I've just kind of thought that hysterical women sounds like endometriosis is a women's only disease. So it can be present in trans men, in non-binary people. Essentially, it's a disease that, grows in people who identify and are born as cis women, but it can affect trans men and non-binary. So just to kind of take that into consideration, because yes, as females, there is so much prejudice against us in the medical industry. They do incredible work in other ways, but unfortunately, we haven't always been served with endometriosis. But also the prejudice that non-binary people and trans men are facing with endometriosis and getting the help that they need is absolutely appalling. And, not only are they dealing with the issues that come with endometriosis, but then all of these other issues where doctors are refusing to treat them because of how they identify. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up, because I didn't want it to come across as it sounded like it was it was only affecting women. So
thank you for that.
No, you're welcome. I just think it's an important discussion. But yeah, so from a holistic point of view, now what I will say is it's not one or the other. People with endometriosis can choose to use both holistic and conventional treatments. If it's safe for them to do so, they might just choose holistic. And then, other people are well within their right just to choose conventional as well. It's not one or the other, and rarely do they interfere with each other. So they can complement each other. But I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't deal with, I don't prescribe hormones. I certainly don't operate on people. I'm a trained health coach. I'm specialized in endometriosis and its co-conditions. So this is my area. But endometriosis is predominantly an inflammatory disease. So this is where a lot of the work is based, calming down that inflammation, because inflammation is a normal immune reaction in the body. And so if you cut yourself, the area will inflame to protect and heal, and to, prevent infection from setting in. But what inflammation will create is pain and swelling and heat. So if you imagine when we have too much of it, we have chronic inflammation, and that's all going on inside on a monthly basis, you can imagine the damage that can do and the pain that can cause. So what we're looking to do is calm down the inflammation, which I'll go into in a second. But then, there are other things that affect endometriosis too, or affect our experience of it. So when you've lived in chronic pain for a long time, as many people with endo have, you can also end up with pelvic floor dysfunction. And I've tried to actually find the official stat for this, but I can't find it. But one of the people, physiotherapists who've been on my podcast, they said that 70% of people with endometriosis have a hypertonic pelvic floor, which essentially means a tight pelvic floor. And what that can present as is like pain with sex, pain with urination, pain with bowel movements. It can also feel like pain in the bladder or pressure in the bladder. Maybe it feels like you can never really empty your bladder or it's always full. It can also cause constipation, but also fecal urgency. So, you can't really hold your stool in, you just have to go. It can cause hip pain, pelvic pain, leg pain, back pain. So this can all come part and parcel of living with endometriosis. So it's important that we address that pelvic floor piece as well, because it's not just the direct endo that's causing the pain. The endo has created other issues that need to be addressed if we want to treat the endometriosis holistically. Then there's also issues with adhesions and fascia. So when someone has a surgery that cuts through your skin, your muscle, but also something called the fascia, which is a sheet, sort of like, think about like a bed sheet that's surrounding all of your organs and keeping them nice and snug and in place. And it's very, very thin. And the way that my pelvic floor physio described it is, imagine if you pinch a bed sheet that was all neat, everything's going to get pulled, right? The rest of the bed sheet's going to get pulled. So if you think about that incision from surgery, that can actually pucker the fascia. And so smoothing that fascia out, loosening that fascia, because that can get, really tight and painful. And then it can basically be yanking all of your pelvic organs in the wrong direction. So for example, with me, because of my surgeries, all of my pelvic organs and basically my whole pelvis is tilting to the right. And that's not just from the fascia, it's from adhesions on my right side as well, which leads me into the adhesions piece. So adhesions are collagen structures. They're like internal scar tissue. And imagine they're sort of like elastic bands that wrap around organs and areas to protect them if there's injury or inflammation or infection, but also a little bit like the spider webs that shoot out of Spider-Man's hands. So they sort of like are very strong and they can grow everywhere. And they often grow too far. So if you have a surgery, the adhesions will develop internally to sort of try and knit you back together to try and help you heal. But they can go too far and they can end up sticking on organs. So for example, I have a stitch on the front of my pelvis and there is an adhesion behind that is stuck from, the scar tissue where the incision was to my bladder. And then I have others that are attaching like across my pelvis. It's like it's a bit of a crisscross going on. And so that can result from surgery. And these adhesions are incredibly strong and they put a lot of pressure and a lot of pain on our organs. And it can feel like you might have a surgery and the surgery went really well. They got it all, they excised it, but you're still in pain. And in those cases, it might not be solely down to the adhesions, but it is most certainly, in part down to the adhesions. The research we found is that somewhere between, it depends on the type of surgery you're having, but in terms of abdominal surgery, it's between 50 to 100% of people with pelvic surgery get adhesions. And if it is extensive surgery, so if someone's had to not just have keyhole, but they've had to have like a really big incision, that's somewhere like 80 to 100%. So these adhesions are a really big problem. And so I really recommend, if my clients have had surgeries, even just one, and they've got this chronic pain, that they get assessed for adhesions and they get their fascia checked and they have some massage and some work. There are a couple of different therapies that will break down those adhesions and smooth out that fascia. Now, adhesions can also occur naturally with endometriosis because adhesions grow wherever there's inflammation. And so the chronic inflammation of endometriosis causes adhesions to grow. So there's like all of this webbing sticking ovaries to the pelvis or like to the bowel. So that can occur. So, some treatments for these adhesions include Arvigo massage, certain types of wound massage like Mercier therapy Clear Passage is really brilliant. Clear Passage is expensive. I haven't tried it. It's too expensive for me, but that has actually got research proven its effectiveness for endometriosis and for co-condition of endometriosis called SIBO. And then there's other more advanced technologies that can deal with adhesions. But the problem with, in the past, they would just cut adhesions. They would open someone back up, cut the adhesions from surgery, for example, and then sew someone back up. But then the adhesions just grow back. So it's helpful if there's not like endometriosis that needs to be dealt with via surgery, it's helpful to address these adhesions in other ways. So that's a big area. And then I'll go into the inflammation piece now, but there's other areas I'd love to talk to you about. But from an inflammation perspective, I work with calming down inflammation through an anti-inflammatory diet that's going to support, someone's lifestyle and food values and choices. It's not, one size fits all, especially because it really depends on your personal sensitivities. So, for example, tomatoes are generally really anti-inflammatory, but they're inflammatory for me because I have histamine issues. So they inflame me. It's not about, I have to cut everything out. It's about what are the foods that are really anti-inflammatory for you, that are really nutrient dense, that are going to give you the nutrients that you need to fight endometriosis. And let's bring those in abundance. And then what are the foods that you might need to be more mindful of? It doesn't mean you can never eat them again, unless, you have something like celiac disease and you can't eat wheat, gluten rather. But it's about a tailored approach. I also work heavily with managing blood sugar, because with blood sugar, we know that if someone has a spike of glucose in their blood, that raises inflammation and it also affects the hormones. So again, we don't want to raise inflammation. We can talk about balancing hormones in a little bit, but from an inflammation perspective, I like to balance blood sugar. There's also calming down inflammation with supplements that have specifically been shown to target endometriosis. Now, we don't have enough research, and it would be nice to have a couple more definitively proven their effectiveness, because not all of them, some of the research has been done on animals. Some of them have been done on humans, which is great, but it'd be good if they could be replicated on a larger scale. But there are supplements like NAC, quercetin, resveratrol, curcumin, pine bark that have been shown to target endometriosis, either slow down the growth, reduce lesion size, shrink the lesions, reduce the amount of estrogen that is kind of growing and progressing the endometriosis in the endometriosis itself. So these supplements can actually reduce the estrogen in the lesions themselves. So supplements can play a really big role in trying to manage the disease. We can never make any guarantees of endometriosis at the moment, right? We don't have a cure. So it's not like definitively any treatment, whether holistic or conventional, is going to cure you. But we can certainly use things to help. So these supplements can be helpful. Then there's some supplements to help with the pain management, like ginger, magnesium, omega-3, curcumin again, quercetin again. So those play a role. I wouldn't recommend that all you do is just supplement, because you might have other things going on in your life, like really, really stress, or, eating a really high inflammatory diet for you. And the supplements can't cancel that out, but they can complement what you're doing. And supporting the immune system, because we do know that inflammation is an immune response, but we know that there's immune dysfunction in endometriosis. So making sure that you can absorb your nutrients properly, that you're eating a nutrient-dense diet. You might need some, 1 or 2 supplements to support your immune system. But there are other areas to inflammation too, like gut health. And that's such a big one. I think it can be overwhelming for people, so I don't always bring it in straight away. But, your gut houses 60 to 70% of your immune system in and around your gut. And so if the gut is irritated or inflamed, or there's an infection there or a condition, that inflammation will spill over into the rest of the body because of the immune response that is occurring kind of between the gut lining and the blood barrier. And so the inflammatory immune cells just kind of spread out to the body, resulting in this chronic inflammation. And so one of the ways that we can calm down inflammation is by calming down the gut. And of course, because the pelvis and the abdomen are, right on top of each other, you're going to feel it there in the pelvis as well. And this is why endometriosis is often misdiagnosed as IBS, because with people with endometriosis, have bloated and they have diarrhea, they have constipation. And so there is I'd love to talk about this in a bit, but there is a correlation between gut conditions and endometriosis. And so that can contribute to pain and pressure and problems in that area. But, essentially inflammation. So calming down the gut is a really key part of the work that I do. And I actually specialize in SIBO, which is a co-condition of endometriosis.
Thank you so much for going into this so deeply, because it really also helps to understand how to approach this condition that is so widely misunderstood, maybe also even with people who experience it and don't really know what is actually going on. And all the information that you give, I can assume that this may give people hope, hey, there is something that I can focus on, something I can try, something I can do to see what works for my body. You gave so many different options, so many different directions for people to look into, like the nutrition part, the lifestyle part, the massage part, body work part, and the various other healthcare providers people can approach with these specific symptoms. So thank you so much for elaborating that and for explaining it in such depth that it's understandable for people. And I feel, like I said earlier, this information has the ability to give hope, to provide opportunity, and to show people that they're not with their backs against the wall, that there is actually so many things that can support them. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And there's a lot that can support them, and that's not even all of it. But what I will say is you don't have to do it all at once. And I don't recommend you do it all at once. I tend to start with nutrition and blood sugar. If nutrition doesn't feel if it feels too much to consider nutrition, then blood sugar management can often be a nice introduction into that. If someone is in just way too much pain to even consider the research and make changes, then I actually might start with 1 or 2 supplements to calm things down. But also, maybe just being I'm just going to try some pelvic floor physiotherapy for a couple of months. That could be the place that someone starts. And we might talk about it, but there are other areas people can start as well. But I do actually have a roadmap, a path that I will walk my clients down, and it's tailored to every single client. So it won't necessarily be that we all start at the same place. It depends what they need, but you certainly do not need to do it all at once. So I just want to reassure people that suddenly oh my God, there's so many things to try. You don't need to try it all.
Thank you for that addition. And I just also want to say that I'm so happy that you're here and that you are, that you're working with clients around this, and that you help them make this manageable, and that you support them finding out what may be the best way to start for them, because it is a lot. And there is not so many places in the medical system where you actually get a full spectrum support. So I love that there's people like you out there who can help people with endo and help them find a comfortable place for them to start their healing journey. So I really wanted to mention that again.
That's so sweet. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
So you mentioned that there may be some other topics that you wanted to dive into.
Couple things. So I'm going to try and put them under an umbrella to simplify it. But what I have seen in my work in the past couple of years and my own experience is that there are co-conditions, but also not necessary conditions, but issues within the body that people will be told, it's just your endometriosis, you have to put up with it, but could actually be improved if we knew what they were. So one of these is HPA axis dysfunction. So people with endometriosis tend to feel chronic fatigue and chronic brain fog. And often we're just told, that's just living with endometriosis. And that can be caused by so many things. It can be caused by chronic inflammation. It can be caused by blood sugar instability. It can be caused by hormonal imbalances. It could be caused by gut issues, malabsorption of nutrients. So there are things to definitely look at. But what the research actually shows is that people with chronic pain conditions, especially people with pelvic pain conditions and endometriosis, have low cortisol output. So HPA axis dysfunction is I don't have it in front of me, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Yes, exactly. That's it.
You have to read it really carefully. And so, in short, this is the pathway in the body that is responsible for your sleep-wake cycle and your stress response. So when people hear the word cortisol, the hormone cortisol, you just think it's the hormone that, creates stress or helps you deal with stress, really. But cortisol is actually what wakes you up in the morning, and it's what powers you through your day. And it should kind of peak in the morning, and then it should start to drop off as the day goes on, and it will drop away in the evening so that melatonin can rise and you can get sleepy. So what can happen if someone has experienced chronic stress, which is, arguably what a lot of us deal with when we have chronic pain? That communication in the brain and this pathway, this HPA axis pathway, can eventually get disrupted to protect the body. And your cortisol might be really, really high for a while. So you might feel really wired. You might not be able to sleep. You might be feeling really anxious. And then eventually you kind of on the flip side, you can't think straight. You're exhausted all the time, no matter how much you sleep. And you might have trouble sleeping as well. So you might actually have what's called a flip curve. So you might feel rubbish during the day, have no energy during the day, but you're wired at night. And that can be because your cortisol is low during the day and it's high at night. So it can present in a couple of different ways. But what the research has shown is that a lot of people with endometriosis have low cortisol. A lot of people with chronic pain, a lot of people with chronic pelvic pain. So I find that nearly all of my clients, we don't always test for it because it's an expensive test. If you want to test, it's a saliva test that you need to get, not a blood test. The most accurate is a saliva test. It's called a cortisol awakening response test. And most of my clients have all of these signs and symptoms. And so we put in these practices in place to support the HPA axis and recover cortisol levels to a normal, healthy level so that they actually have the energy to live and they can think clearly, because this has such a detrimental effect on people's livelihoods, right? They can barely work, or they can't look after their family, or they can't see their friends. They can just about make it through work, but they have to sleep all weekend. So that's a really big area. But as I said, the fatigue can be affected by many, many things. And then there's also hormonal issues. So we know that endometriosis is largely, not all the time, because there's been some research showing that not all endometriosis lesions respond to estrogen, and some of them respond to progesterone, and some of them are resistant to both, and all of these. But largely, most of the research points to estrogen being a fertilizer of endometriosis. So it kind of continues the growth. So we don't want to completely reduce the estrogen. Now, that is the method of conventional hormonal treatments. In most cases, they will actually dramatically reduce the estrogen. But, if someone isn't on hormonal birth control, that's not what I do. I try to bring it into balance because there are benefits, many, many benefits of estrogen, which I'm sure you've talked about on the podcast before. And if we have low estrogen, we can feel like crap as well. So we do work with balancing the estrogen levels. That is, around blood sugar management. That's a huge one. Supporting the liver and the detoxification processes, making sure that there's not a buildup of old and excess estrogen in the bloodstream. Removing any toxins that might mimic estrogen and may actually contribute to endometriosis. There is some research. It's not definitive yet, but there's research pointing to certain toxins in the environment contributing to endometriosis. So we're very mindful of those. And also we support the gut because the research has shown, I think probably more research needs to be done, but it's showing that the gut bacteria of people with endometriosis could be favoring an estrogenic environment, meaning that there are enzymes in the gut that recirculate old estrogen. So the liver packages up the estrogen to get rid of once it's being used. It dumps it in the gut to be removed in the stools. But actually there's a group of bacteria that create this enzyme, and this enzyme beta-glucuronidase can actually basically turn estrogen into, a shiny new estrogen and get it reabsorbed into the bloodstream for use. And what they're finding is that people with endometriosis may have higher levels of beta-glucuronidase. And I've seen it a couple of times, not every time. So that might be needing to be addressed too. So that is kind of one side of the hormonal piece. But also, when I was talking about, conditions and issues, one of these issues with estrogen is that someone might have estrogen dominant symptoms. So this is when you either have too much estrogen or you just have low progesterone and normal levels of estrogen, but that still creates an estrogen dominant scenario where the estrogen is dominating over progesterone, or you have low progesterone and high estrogen. So when that happens, we actually often have symptoms that mimic endometriosis. Painful cramps, lots of heavy bleeding, although that's not directly caused by the endometriosis itself, but is often like a co-condition like heavy menstrual bleeding, or it might be from adenomyosis as well. But a lot of people will find that their symptoms of endometriosis are exaggerated in the presence of estrogen dominance. So I do a lot of work around balancing their hormones if they're not on birth control or they're not on hormonal treatments. And then as a result, their endometriosis symptoms get better because the estrogen dominance is either exaggerating the symptoms or it looks like endometriosis symptoms when it's actually like estrogen problems. So that's something that I work on too. But then there are also these other co-conditions. So people with endometriosis, not all of them, but I see, at least in my practice, a lot of histamine problems. And we do know that histamine, which is, an immune response, it has a lot of roles in the body, but you might know it as the thing that causes you to sneeze when it's like hay fever season or you pick up a cat. But histamine is involved in the progression of endometriosis. It's also involved in ovulation and menstruation. So when we have high levels, we can actually get more pain and cramping. Histamine is an inflammatory immune cell. As much as it serves great purposes in the body, in too high levels, it can cause problems. And people with endometriosis have higher levels in and around the endometriosis lesions, and it's being made in too large amounts. But what we're seeing is people with endometriosis in the research tend to have a history of allergies and histamine-related problems and conditions, or allergy conditions like eczema and, food allergies and things like this. And so we may want to work on the histamine piece. Some people are more sensitive to histamine and some aren't. And what I'm seeing, which is really interesting, is people who haven't been as responsive to changing their diet or managing their blood sugar, you start working on their histamine and their periods get better, their endometriosis symptoms get better. And so we could dive into an entire episode into the histamine piece, because actually there are kind of a couple co-conditions related to endometriosis and histamine problems, and it's just a whole thing. You could really do a whole episode, but I just wanted to touch upon that briefly. And then there's also interstitial cystitis. So the modern name is, I think, bladder pain syndrome, but it's just kind of traditionally known as interstitial cystitis. And this is a condition where I think it's classed as a syndrome rather than a condition, but it can cause pain in the bladder, pressure in the bladder, frequency, urgency. It can feel like you can never empty your bladder properly. And it tends to get worse at night as well. And that has been dubbed as the evil twin of endometriosis because it's so common in people with endometriosis. But of course, it's all in the same area. So you might feel like it's all endometriosis pain, but it actually might be also down to interstitial cystitis. And if we're only treating the endometriosis, you might never get this resolution or reduction in pain because some of it could be stemming from the bladder. And I have interstitial cystitis, but until I got my endometriosis under control, I couldn't tell the difference between the endo pain and the bladder pain. And then once my endometriosis symptoms subsided, there was this leftover bladder pain that I could really pinpoint was my bladder. And I was able to start noticing what symptoms were related to that. And I finally, got this diagnosis of interstitial cystitis. And that is quite a complicated condition. And it is another chronic condition, unfortunately. But there are many things that contribute to it. So pelvic floor dysfunction. So addressing that will help with the bladder. Inflammation. So lowering the inflammation will help with that. But there are also things like high histamine issues. So people with interstitial cystitis tend to have higher levels of histamine in the bladder, so lowering histamine. But also gut health issues can really affect the bladder. So that leads me on to this other condition called small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And that's my other specialist subject. So I specialize in endometriosis and SIBO, which is another condition I have. Yay me. And so SIBO is, if you think about your gut bacteria, when people say like, oh, good gut bugs, they're really talking about your large intestine. You should only have like a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of bacteria in your small intestine. And what should happen normally is that a wave-like motion called the migrating motor complex cleans out your small intestine 2 hours after you eat and overnight. And that keeps your small intestine clean, clear of food and clear of bacteria. But what happens in people with small intestine bacterial overgrowth is that migrating motor complex is either damaged and it's not really working, or there's an obstruction in the small intestine that stops it from doing its job. And so the migrating motor complex is working fine, but there's like a kink in the small intestine. There's pockets of kind of like bubbles in the small intestine where like bacteria can gather and grow. And so the bacteria starts to build up and you get huge bloating. This is a signature symptom of SIBO, bloating, which we see in people with endometriosis. We call it the endo belly. But what the research is showing is that it's small research at the moment, but the current research is estimating 80% of people with endometriosis have SIBO. And also, people with endometriosis are often diagnosed, or at least they might also have a diagnosis of IBS, but they also misdiagnose with IBS. But the research is now showing that 60 to 70% of IBS cases are SIBO. So not only is it causing this bloating, it's causing diarrhea, constipation, abdominal pain, pelvic pain, burping, acid reflux, nausea, vomiting, all of these IBS symptoms that people with endometriosis also suffer with. And I mean, the reason why I specialize in it is because I haven't had one client come to me and not have some kind of IBS issue or not have endobelly. I mean, I did a poll on my Instagram and 100% of people said they had endobelly. They had this bloating. And it can be to do with the inflammation of the endometriosis to a degree, but it's also going to be largely about gut dysbiosis, which we know is an issue with people with endometriosis. It could also be to do with the adhesions, creating these pockets of gas where the intestines aren't able to move properly. There are a couple of different things. I actually have an episode on this, like what could be causing your endobelly or your bloating. But SIBO is a really large piece of the puzzle. So that is another co-condition that we're finding with endometriosis that I work with. And it can cause interstitial cystitis and histamine intolerance. So they're all connected. And also it can cause fibromyalgia as well. There's a really strong correlation between fibromyalgia and certain types of SIBO, and people with endometriosis often, and not all of them, I actually don't know if there's a stat, but a lot of them are also diagnosed with fibromyalgia, which is like a full body pain. So I do a lot of, I will work with the endometriosis, but I will look at what else is going on, because if we know what the beast is, so to say, we know how to tame it. Like some people are really overwhelmed where they're like, oh, I don't want, all of these other conditions. And I really, really understand that. And I had to go through my own mourning period, when I had these new diagnoses. But once you know what they are, it puts you in control of them rather than the other way around. You know how to treat them rather than waking up and feeling like, why do I always feel awful every day? Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for elaborating on all these different conditions and how they can be related to endo. I'm sure that a lot of people are unaware of this.
Yeah, I absolutely, I think that we're now starting to see the links, but for a long time, you were dismissed with not having, a problem. Then you would get diagnosed with endometriosis, and then all of your symptoms were being dismissed as, it's just endometriosis, you've got to live with it. And I'm here to say it's probably not just endometriosis. It might not be another condition. It might be something like you've got a bit of estrogen dominance or a little bit of HPA axis dysfunction. That's not a condition. Those are just sort of like hiccups, right, in the body, which can be fairly easily resolved. But there's usually a couple of things going on that if we can spend some time working on them slowly at a pace that feels manageable to someone, in a way that feels manageable, then we can significantly improve someone's quality of life.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us and for also affirming that it's possible to improve your experience of your body, to improve the quality of life, because I can totally imagine that is sometimes hard to imagine if you are in constant pain and having constant symptoms in your body that disrupt your life, your work, and just your experience of being human.
Yeah, absolutely. And Iris, could I just quickly mention very briefly some other things that people might want to look out for?
Yeah, sure, of course.
So this is a sort of a new area for me, but it's something that I've been seeing in myself and other clients, and I started doing some research into it. And it was actually brought to my attention in my training with SIBO. So SIBO can basically be caused by a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, the hypermobile type of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So there's 13 different types of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and it's the hypermobile one. All of them can affect it, but I'm kind of spotlighting hypermobile right now. And EDS is a condition that affects the connective tissue, the collagen, the soft tissue of the body. And it can result in like really bendy joints and hypermobility. It can cause other issues in the other types of EDS, but most of them are rare. The most common one is the hypermobility type. And it can cause SIBO because it creates droopy intestines. So the migrating motor complex can't move the bacteria out. But over time, hypermobile EDS has a lifespan where over time it actually creates a stiffening of the joints. And you might not even have appeared very bendy in the first place. So you might have never thought that was you, but then over time your joints have started to get really, really painful. You're getting full body pain, muscle pain. And this is because EDS has a lifespan. It sort of changes over time and your muscles start to get stiff to try and hold your joints in place because they were so bendy. So EDS can come with two other co-conditions. Mast cell activation syndrome, which is basically a histamine condition. So the mast cells are what release histamine. And so mast cell activation syndrome is when the mast cells are making too much histamine. And then postural tachycardia syndrome, which is a condition which can cause dizziness, fainting, racing heart, palpitations, chest pain, chronic fatigue. And I'm seeing this more and more in my seat because I attract a lot of people with endo and SIBO, and a lot of them have the histamine piece. A lot of them have the full body pain. A lot of them have the dizziness and the fainting. And so I wanted to mention that because they are finding that people with hypermobility, so just hypermobility without the EDS, and hypermobile EDS, both have, I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but you can look this up, have more painful periods, heavier bleeding, I believe maybe pain during sex, a lot of gynae conditions essentially. And there is now a correlation between hypermobile EDS and endometriosis. I think more research is being done, but it is being recognized now and they're looking into it more. And I went to see a doctor last week for heart pain that I've been having and dizziness and shortness of breath. And I suspected that I have mast cell activation syndrome, EDS and POTS. And we're going to investigate it. But he, without me saying it, this is what he thought I had too. And he said that he said, the majority of my patients are young women with endometriosis, with interstitial cystitis, with POTS, EDS and mast cell activation syndrome. And he said, I see about 70 a week like you. And I was just like, wow, okay, because I had been looking into this, doing the research, reading up on it, talking to my colleagues, talking to my clients, and to have a cardiologist say that he said, young women coming in with chest pain, feeling like they're having a heart attack. And he said, most of them fit, your description. They have endo, they have IC, they have SIBO as well, or they might not know they have SIBO. They certainly have IBS or IBS issues. It's just incredible to hear how many people he was seeing. So there might, even if there's just one person out there who's just like, oh my God, that sounds like me. Like I need to raise that because I'm seeing it so often. And we don't connect the dots because you think, oh, I have bendy joints. That's got nothing to do with my endometriosis, but it actually might. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And my jaw is on the floor again.
It's crazy.
It's like, wow, like so many connections. And it all makes so much sense. If you look at each issue and each set of symptoms together and then you put them together, it all connects the dots. Like also what we learn in the training. And why is nobody talking about this? I mean, you are, and I'm so grateful.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I have pieced it together mainly from my SIBO training because endometriosis is a cause of SIBO. And basically, the adhesions from endometriosis can impact the migrating motor complex. And so we end up getting SIBO, but also it's a bit of a chicken or the egg scenario. SIBO, the toxins from SIBO have actually been found to be involved in the development and progression of endometriosis. So which came first? We don't know. But it's really through my SIBO training that because they do talk about endometriosis in the context of that, they'll be talking about hypermobile EDS or they'll be talking about mast cell activation syndrome and they're just randomly mention, and menstrual activation syndrome and endometriosis. And I'm like, okay, none of my endo stuff is talking about this. But weirdly, I mean, I think these things just come in trends. Since I've been looking into it, I've also noticed other practitioners are also talking about it. I think the Endometriosis Summit might have had like an interview or a lecture or something on hypermobility and endo. So I haven't listened to it, but you could check that out. There is a video by Dr. Guggenheim, who is an EDS specialist, and she does talk about the connection with endometriosis and menstrual activation syndrome. And there are like lectures you can download and things online if you Google it. Some of my other stuff is in my training. So unless you're going to go and be a SIBO practitioner, I don't recommend that. But yeah, you can find this information, but you just have to search for it. But I do think people are talking about it more now.
And I'm really glad about that it's getting more out there, and basically people receive better care because the understanding of this is coming more to the forefront. And I really hope it keeps spreading, Jessica, because so many people are suffering with this. And if your doctor says that he sees 70 other people per week and he sees it so often,
I know.
People need to know this. People have the right to this information.
I don't know if he's the type, but I'm hoping I can try and drag him onto my podcast, but I'm not really sure if it's the podcast type. We'll see. But what I will do is I will happily send you links to the resources that are available to like the public who aren't, going to train in SIBO or endo, that are about these issues, so that they can have a little bit of a read if that helps.
Yeah, that would be great. And thank you so much for coming on here, for taking the time to explain everything so detailed and in such comprehensive language so that we understand what's going on, what each condition means, how it manifests in the body. And I'm curious whether you could share with us where people can find you if people recognize themselves in your story and what you shared and they need extra help. What is the best way to find you?
Yeah, so I am currently at www.thisendolife.com. I don't know when this episode's coming out, but I am changing in about 2 to 3 weeks to the endobellycoach.com, because obviously I specialize in SIBO and I do a lot of work around gut health. I'm still going to be doing exactly the same stuff, endometriosis with its gut conditions and the SIBO that comes with it. And so the Endobelly Coach just fits me better. So my site will redirect. So even if you Google thisendolife.com, it will redirect when that's up. I am currently at this_endolife on Instagram, but it will change to the Endobelly Coach in a couple of weeks. And I have a podcast called This Endo Life 2. That is just going to stay This Endo Life for the time being. And I have multiple articles online under Endometriosis News and Endometriosis Net. So if anyone just fancies a read, you can just Google my name and Google those news outlets and you will come to my column. And there's like hundreds to read from if anyone likes to geek out and read about endo.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Jessica. I really appreciate having you here. And usually at the end of the podcast, I ask people like, what is the most important way for you to plant seeds in this world? But for you, it seems to be really clear that that you just are so well trained and so good at spreading this information in a very accurate and holistic way. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you. It does feel like what I was born to do, I think. So I do think that's my planting seeds in the world. Endo and SIBO and their co-conditions is what I'm passionate about. And making endo-friendly cakes. That's another one.
Do you have any recipes for that people can find?
I have loads of recipes. I would actually say the ones on thisendolife.com I actually want to get rid of, so you can ignore them. But I have recipes on Endometriosis Net. My buttercream recipe is up on there. My brownie recipe is up on there. I mean, there's loads. I've got 2 ice cream recipes up on there. There are more on there, but from like a sweet perspective. And I know they'll be releasing more, but there's quite a backlog of recipes at the moment. So I don't know when they're going to be out, but there's going to be like my sponge cake and all of those things coming out soon.
Amazing. That sounds delicious. So if people are interested to find that, go look it up. and make your own cakes.
Yeah, I'll send you the links so you can share them. And I just want to reassure again that I think that this is a lot of information because this is a single podcast where I work with clients for, half a year, sometimes longer. I've been working with one for 2 years. You're not going to have all of these conditions. You might not have any. You might have a bit of estrogen dominance, who knows? But this is a very gentle walk. Not even people say it's a marathon, not a race. We're not even in that league. We're not in a marathon. We're not in a race. We're taking a walk with endo, and we're addressing things bit by bit on the way. You don't have to sort all of this out in a month, in a year. As you work through the different options that feel right for you, pretty much most of these conditions will improve bit by bit along the way as well. Histamine is a little bit trickier because it can get irritated by different foods, but you're already looking after your body in all of these conditions just by making positive changes. So I just want to reassure people that they don't go away oh my God, there's so much to fix. Look at your main symptom and start with your main symptom and pick one area to begin to work with. Like I said, I start with nutrition or blood sugar, but you can pick wherever you fancy starting. So I just want to make sure people don't leave overwhelmed is what I'm saying.
Thank you for reassuring that. And I feel it's important because it's a lot, everything that has to do with our menstrual cycles. And when we start optimizing and healing them, it has to be started slowly and gently and like a slow walk, as you say, not like a marathon. That's impossible.
Yeah, absolutely. And, they have your resource and your podcast to talk more about menstrual cycle and living in harmony with that. And I think that plays a really big role in endometriosis as well. But I imagine if they listen to you and follow your work, then people do take it at a gentle pace and are kind to their bodies along the way.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I hope for people.
I think so. I'm sure.
So Jessica, thank you again so much for coming on, for sharing all your valuable wisdom and knowledge and research. And I hope that a lot of people who hear this end up working with you.
Thank you. I guess I should mention that I do have one-on-one coaching and courses. I have 3 different types of courses. The Endo Belly course is coming out at the end of May. And then Live and Thrive with Endo, which is endometriosis specific, is in September. And I have masterclasses and things like that. That's all on the website. So if people go there, that's where they can find it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing that. And have a beautiful day. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, with your friends, with your family, post about it on social media, or leave a rating or a review on all the platforms. To catch all the latest news from me, you can follow at the Planting Seeds Podcast on Instagram or at Cycle Seeds on Instagram, or you can go to my website www.cycleseeds.com. Thank you again so much, and I'll see you next time.